Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to Atlanta History Center. My name is Claire Haley. I'm Vice President of Special Projects here for Atlanta History Center, and it's absolutely my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Livingston lecture featuring Steve Inskeep in conversation with Josie Duffy Rice. Now, before we get started tonight, we have some news hot off the press as of 7 p.m. this evening. The book is officially on the New York Times bestseller list, so please join me in congratulating Steve. Now, what that means for all of you, we have a very important job tonight. That means that your book that you're purchasing tonight will help him make a run next week at the New York Times bestseller list. So if you don't already have your Christmas shopping done, you can get it done tonight. The books are available out in the lobby for 25% off. And one more thing, I think I mentioned this earlier when we chatted about starting a little bit late, but if you do have a cell phone on you, if you could go ahead and make sure that is off or on silent, we would really appreciate it. We are making a recording of tonight's conversation, so we appreciate your help in making sure that that's uninterrupted. Now, Abraham Lincoln, that is probably someone who has had more books written about him than most figures in American history. Despite that, the Lincoln that Steve Inskeep uncovers in his book, Differ We Must, How Lincoln Succeeded in a Divided America, is probably a version of Lincoln that you haven't yet encountered. He recalls all the nuances that made Lincoln who he was through the relationships and the people that he connected with, the people who disagreed with him, and in most cases, passionately disagreed with him. I walked away with a renewed appreciation for Lincoln's political acumen and admiration of his ability to know when to listen, when to stand firm, and when to compromise. I hope that you do as well, and I hope that you will buy the book so you can continue that exploration after tonight's conversation. Now, a little bit about tonight's author and moderator, and then we will welcome them out to get started this evening. Steve Inskeep, of course, is the co-host of NPR's Morning Edition, the most widely heard radio program in the United States, and of NPR's Up First, one of the nation's most popular podcasts. His reporting has taken him not only all over the United States, but all over the world, Middle East, Latin America, Africa, Pakistan, China. His appreciation for the full story and news took him to an exploration of history. His previous books include Instant City, Jackson Land, and Imperfect Union. We are thrilled to be welcoming Steve back tonight after an 8-year hiatus from his last book, Jackson Land. He will be in conversation tonight with Josie Duffy Rice. She is a journalist, writer, law school graduate, and podcast host whose work primarily focuses on prosecutors, prisons, and criminal justice issues. She is a co-host and writer of several podcasts, but her work has been featured in many, many places: New York Times, Vanity Fair, New Yorker, The Atlantic, and Slate, just to name a few. She is based right here in Atlanta, so thank you for joining us for tonight's Livingston lecture. We are thankful for the Livingston Foundation for making these events possible. You are in for a treat tonight. Please join me in welcoming Steve Inskeep and Josie Duffy Rice.
Thank you.
Wow. Are we okay? You can hear us.
It's great to be here.
It is. It's very exciting. I have been told, my father's in the audience, and he has told me to tell everybody that I left my book and my notes in my Uber, and that is why I'm looking on my phone. I had written them on paper, but I am now looking on my phone because they're in.
It turns out when I talk, most people just look at their phone.
Promise, just the notes app, I promise. I'm really excited to be here, Steve. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
And congratulations on the New York Times bestseller list,
Thank
which
you very much.
Discovered at dinner and was very calm about, much calmer than I would ever be were I reading that list.
Should we disclose that this is the third time this has happened to you?
It is. Turns out I'm a lucky charm, if you want to make the New York Times bestseller list, because I have now been in the room 3 times when someone has made the list. Did I have anything to do with their books? No. But was I in the room? Yes.
It's just one final requirement to make the list.
Yes. That's the last deal that you have to make. So all night I've been repeating parts of Steve's book, even though it's his book, but I loved it so much, and I really, really enjoyed reading it and learned more than I've learned in high school history, which, if my history teacher is here, that's my fault, not yours. But I was interested because when I started writing my book, a friend of mine, I said, well, I think everything's been said. And he said, they still write autobiographies about Jesus, which was very enlightening to me. And I thought about this with Lincoln. I mean, so many books have been written, but you have a totally new kind of angle on who was the most popular and well-known politician probably in American history. Can you talk a little bit about why now?
Yeah.
And why and how you came to realize that this was the kind of take you wanted to take on Lincoln?
Yeah, I mean, now is part of it. I hope that this book speaks to our times. I cover the news and write history, and doing one informs the other, and doing the other informs the one. Studying history changes which news stories I think are important, and tends to make me think that a lot of breaking urgent news is stuff that we don't actually need to know in the long term, to be honest with you. But certain other things are like long term and really matter. And studying history changes the way that I think about news. Doing the news changes the way that I think about history, because I cover political figures today and get to study human beings up close and then try to figure out what was going through the minds of human beings 150 or more years ago based on their letters and other documents and different fragments of evidence that are there. And you try to rely on the fact that human nature doesn't change that much to understand it. I have always admired Abraham Lincoln, been interested in Abraham Lincoln. I grew up in Indiana, which is where Lincoln spent the majority of his youth. And so when you grow up in Indiana, you get a lot of Lincoln propaganda. I don't know if you get that quite the same in a city that...
We get propaganda, but not the same.
But I grant that it's a city that Lincoln's troops burned. But great national figure, very important national figure. And you find out about his youth. You find out about him growing up in a log cabin, barefoot in the woods, being handed an axe when he was a child and told by his father to help clear the woods. You find out that his mother died when he was quite young, and that he had a difficult life, that he had virtually no education, that he all but taught himself to read, and through an incredible study of books, became a lawyer and eventually a great political figure. So you find out all of this stuff. I still hesitated to write anything about Lincoln because he is so well known. What could possibly be said? And then I wrote a couple of books about the 19th century, which were alluded to before, and Lincoln was a minor character in each of them. And so this figure that I'd been fascinated by for years, I studied a little more closely and studied a little more closely. And then I was thinking about the diversity, the growing diversity of this country, and thinking about how diverse America was then. Even though there was only one kind of person who had all the power and virtually all the attention, there were all these other kinds of people in America then, in the 19th century. And I thought that I might be able to tell Lincoln's whole life story through his series of meetings that he had with different kinds of people. And that would illustrate something about Lincoln and something about America too. And I ended up doing that, although the book evolved, because I began writing in early 2020. I don't know if you guys are aware, there were things that happened in 2020. The pandemic, an election, an attempt to overturn the obvious election result. I think Georgia had something to do with it. And so I'm covering all this news at the same time I'm writing the book, and I realized that it wasn't just differences, different kinds of people and backgrounds that was the story, it was disagreement. How did this guy in a tremendously divided nation deal with people who differed with him on vital moral subjects? And how did he make allies, and when did he decide he couldn't make an alliance? And so it was a book that I want it to be about then. I'm not trying to write about the present while pretending to write about the past. It really is a story of the past, but it felt intensely relevant to my life as a journalist.
Absolutely. I mean, that was my major takeaway from the book, is how much of it echoes, including the disagreements. What's at issue?
Yeah.
Where do people fall? It echoes a lot of what we see today. And there's something very interesting. At the beginning of the book, you kind of talk about his self-confidence, how you talk about when he was 21, he went and he made a speech even though he wasn't running for office. We were talking about him wrestling earlier this evening, and you talk about this sort of sense he sort of had of being able to talk to people, of bargain, of be a really talented politician. And it occurred to me that today that might be met with skepticism instead of endearment.
Yeah.
that this idea of wanting to be a politician is seen as almost sleazy in some spaces versus noble. And I was wondering how you think that the context of his qualities would play today.
Yeah, he certainly took a different approach than a lot of people do today. He was an openly humble guy, like an explicitly humble guy. He was almost arrogant in his humility, like he would get out there. He in his very first campaign statement in 1832, when he was 23 years old, he had the ambition, as a guy who had barely ever been to school, to run for the state legislature, which is wild. But then in his first campaign announcement, he basically said, "I have ever been in the most humble walks of life." He played up the poverty of his upbringing. There was another occasion where he said his whole youth could be summed up in the phrase, "the short and simple annals of the poor." He was a very humble guy, and this continued right through the Gettysburg Address, in which he says, he takes some of the 272 words to say, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here." He put that in the most famous speech in American history. That is humility on a grand scale. But you said confidence. I think it came from a place of confidence. He was aware that he was a smart guy who could figure things out. And he didn't feel that he had to inflate himself or act like he was more than he was. He also was responding to what I call a culture of equality, in that a lot of people then, or at least white men, we can talk about the gaps in the culture of equality in a moment, expected each other to relate to each other on a basically equal basis. And if somebody tried to get above himself, his fellow citizens might drag him down. And you can think of the phrases now that reflect that culture of equality, like getting above yourself, putting on airs. Lincoln tried to emphasize his humility while also being ambitious. But he did a lot of things that political figures, some leading political figures today don't do. I mean, he didn't demonize the opposition. He saw slavery as a great moral cause. He saw the system of slavery as a moral outrage. From about 1854 onward, he talked about almost nothing else. But he did not take it personally. He did not even say that slave owners were any particularly different as human beings as anybody else. And people who were opposed to slavery were not necessarily better human beings than anybody else. They were people who needed to work together to change a system that was an outrage. He didn't virtue signal. He didn't pretend he was better than other people. And he didn't play what we call base politics, where you appeal to your most extreme supporters and try to grow that most extreme support. He was building coalitions, which is a very different skill.
One of my favorite parts of the book is the 1860 election, because the way Steve writes it, so you learn that basically Lincoln made no statements throughout this entire campaign, just kind of.
Can you imagine that? Like presidential candidates, it's considered unseemly for them to go out and like give speeches and debates
Tell
and so
people
forth.
what they think, which
Yeah.
feels to me like something you might want to know before
He
you go to the
didn't
polls.
send a single tweet the entire campaign.
And then he wins, and there's no victory speech. He goes home, and he goes to bed. And the way you described it was that he felt kind of this weight of what was coming, because he saw that the country was at a fracture in a way that other people did not perceive. And then what I love about this is that a few days later, when he's asked to compromise by the Democrats in the South, he says, you know, I won on this platform. I can't really go back. And you're like, what platform? You didn't make any statements this whole time. It feels very funny to say you won on a platform that you didn't actually make. But I thought that was a smart politician on his part. I'm interested in what you think about what it looks like to run for an office today, where you're asked to comment on everything all of the time.
Yeah.
Is there a Lincoln path forward to something like that?
In a way there is. I mean, one of the things that I realized in studying Lincoln that I didn't understand before is that while he was an eloquent speaker, I'm just going to ask, are there people here who have like books of Lincoln speeches in your house? Like, Yeah, a number of people are raising hands. You know, you can just yell out the word Abe or something. And so there's a number of people that like, you know, have that stuff around the house because he's such a brilliant writer. There are pieces of great literature that were political speeches of Lincoln. But what was just as important with him is what he didn't say, his silences. He could almost be deceptive in his silences. In a campaign, if he did talk, as he did in some of the others, he would only talk about the issue that he considered to be most important, and he would fall silent on everything else. He would avoid distractions. He wouldn't answer every insult or every attack. He was so careful about what he said that a close friend and ally of his said Lincoln would be very affable. He'd tell jokes. He'd tell stories. He'd say so much and seem so candid that a visitor would go away with the impression that he had disclosed everything, when in reality he had been so careful about what he didn't say that he had disclosed nothing about his plans and his purposes. He was a very careful speaker, and that is very different than some people today where they're like looking for the moment to get attention, the moment. And all the incentives today, I think, are built for that. The incentives today are built to grab any kind of attention you can, and negative attention is just as good as any other kind of attention. There's an attention economy. And he was doing it a little differently. There are some political leaders who attempt this today. I'm not saying Joe Biden is like Lincoln in any way by this statement, but Biden says less than some other presidents. I, as a journalist, find this frustrating because my job is to get these guys to talk, and he rarely does interviews. I find it particularly outrageous that he hasn't talked to me in years, but so that's my job. And like we all have a role, right? My job is to get him on the record and get him to talk. His job is to follow whatever political strategy he has, and we could speculate about the reasons that he doesn't do as many interviews as other presidents. But strictly as a political strategy, it is interesting to only speak out when you want to. Mm-hmm. There's nothing to that. There are other people who are great communicators. I mean, the previous Democratic President, Obama, was another person who spoke a lot, but spoke with exceptional care and commented on the things that he wanted to comment on. Trump.
Very careful, known for being very careful.
Careful, hardly said anything. Yeah. Spoke a lot. In fact, I mean, that was part of the problem with Trump as a national figure, is that he would say a flood of words that were subject to almost any interpretation, really. And I'm not saying that was a totally failed communication strategy, because he won the presidency once and is still the leader of a large political movement, but it's a different style of communication. And I think that the more traditional style of presidential communication was effectively Lincoln's style, saying only those things that you want to say and falling silent on other things. And not all of us get to be president, but there is a little bit of value, I think, in that in our daily lives. We don't have to answer every email. You know, we don't have to get on every email chain. We don't have to answer every tweet or X or whatever they are today. We don't have to fire off every time someone says something that's irritating. That requires a lot of patience, which is a quality that Lincoln had. But I think it gives our words more power when we do speak.
Your point about Obama and Biden, reading the book, I could see at least the last 3 Democratic presidents reflected in Lincoln in different ways. And so Obama, you get this sense of, we're not a red-blue America, we're a purple America, we're all the same, and kind of no high highs, no low lows. Yeah. There's a sense of the Clinton ability to kind of connect with people, et cetera. But the thing I thought a lot about Biden was the loss. So Lincoln lost 2 children.
Yeah.
And Biden's lost 2 children. And you've talked about Lincoln's kind of struggle with mental health and depression.
Yeah.
His wife's struggle with mental health and depression. I wonder how you think that impacted his presidency and his kind of his approach to the presidency in that sort of struggle sense.
Yeah, I think that he could relate to people, he could relate to ordinary people, and he had in some ways a kind of dark idea of the universe. His faith or his religion is a little bit hard to plumb, as people in this room who've studied Lincoln a little bit know. It's easy to say he was a Christian. It's easy to say that he was not, because he was never a member of an organized church. He never signed up for anybody's creed. He did, in some of his great speeches, refer to God. On other occasions, he referred to some force that seemed to control people that was beyond the mind itself, but he didn't call it God. So it's a little hard to figure out, but he did seem to have this broad idea of destiny, of events moving in ways that are beyond our control, which makes him in some ways a fatalist. That's a word that's sometimes used. And fatalist sounds pretty bad. I mean, fatal is right there in the word. But I think that it had a slightly different quality for Lincoln. It helped him prioritize. It helped him think about the long term. It helped him understand, in some cases, how little he could accomplish, but then to focus on the things that he could. I guess I should have mentioned, if I haven't yet, I mean, this ends up telling his life story through these 16 meetings with people who disagreed with them, and in many cases the disagreement is one facet or another over slavery. He's going too fast on slavery. He's not going nearly fast enough on slavery, depending on the person who's in the room. And when we look at Lincoln's record on slavery, it is the area that is easiest to criticize him for today, and he was criticized then. He said things before being president, even while being president, that just by definition, by our terms, would be racist. He did not call for immediate abolition at a time when other people did. He was trying to do something practical. He always knew that slavery was wrong, always spoke of it with moral outrage, and felt that the Constitution prohibited him and others from doing anything about it in states that practiced it. And so he called to contain it and limit its spread with a hope that it would someday end. And I think this gets to the essence of his politics. It's a little hard for us to work with today because we view race as an all-in or all-out proposition where you're either absolutely right or you're in a horrible position. And Lincoln was looking at it as a practical problem, an enormous system of economic power that was backed up by law, that was backed up by prejudice and custom and tradition, that was extraordinarily hard to do anything about, that was backed up by economic interest. There were so many people who profited from slavery in one way or another. The whole country, he eventually said, was complicit in slavery. And so his question was not, can I show that I am morally correct by denouncing this? Or his question was, what can I do about this as a political leader, as a citizen that will move the country in the right direction? And what we see in these meetings, I believe, is Lincoln trying by various gambits to build coalitions of people in an almost entirely white electorate who will vote for something better than what they had been doing up to then. And I think this is another thing that translates to now. Fortunately, we do not have that great problem, but we have other big long-term issues that we have lots of disagreements about and that we need to build coalitions to deal with.
I have 11 follow-up questions to that, but I will start with one.
One word answer to each. That's fine.
The first one is about this kind of conundrum that your book presents, which is that Lincoln is this incredible politician, and he's very skilled. I mean, when you read it, you get a very strong sense of him. I love the part where he says to someone, I'll only run for office if you're not going to run, because I don't want to get in your way.
Yeah.
And you can see this man's ego just inflating in the moment. He's very good at making alliances and making friends and gaining trust of people in the moment. And he's president during the biggest fracture of American history. I mean, he's president when the country splits in half, right? And it begs the question of why. You get the impression he believes that slavery is bad, but that it's not. Like, he's not Owen Lovejoy. He's not these people who are living and dying by this proposition, right? But he takes this bet. I mean, he could in theory, he could just put this off for 8 years, right? He could say, I'm not going to make this decision.
Yeah.
I'm going to let the next president make it. I'm not going to go out on this limb if it's going to divide the country.
Yeah.
And yet he does, which seems in some ways at odds of his demeanor, his kind of constitution.
Yeah, I think so. It's a nuance. It's a complexity. I guess we should explain that, and many people in this room may be quite familiar with it. Lincoln was elected in 1860 on an anti-slavery platform by the Republican Party. The Republicans insisted that they did not threaten those who were practicing slavery in slave states because they couldn't do anything about it constitutionally. So they're like, well, we're not going to break the Constitution. You know, stop worrying so much. But we also think you're wrong. Ultimately, the bottom line of Lincoln's campaign, and people did have his prior public statements, by the way, and there was a party platform, even if he said very little. The bottom line was slavery is wrong. And this was something that Southern leaders could not abide and considered to be unacceptable, which is why they came to try to break up the country. And you are right in noting that Lincoln was offered a compromise, in a sense. One of my 16 meetings is with a man named Duff Green, who I label a conspiracy theorist. Everybody in the book has like a title, so, you know, like activist or extremist or conspiracy theorist or partisan, labels to people we can relate to today, I hope. Duff Green is a conspiracy theorist. He's a newspaper man and propagandist who'd known various presidents since Andrew Jackson, which is where I first discovered his name when learning about that president. And he was a man who was in favor of equality, except when it came to slaves. And he became obsessed with slavery, as a matter of fact. He was a slave owner himself, and from the slave state of Kentucky. And he approached Abraham Lincoln in December of 1860, this man who had just won the election. And he said, listen, I want you to endorse this compromise that people are cooking up in Washington. This is in Springfield, Illinois. I'd really want you to endorse this compromise. I need your help. All you have to do to save the Union and avoid a big war is agree to enshrine slavery in the Constitution forever.
And then make a rule that you can't amend that amendment.
Yes, that's the most incredible thing. Like multiple constitutional amendments, and one of them is slavery is with us forever, and number 2 is no one can ever repeal that amendment. It's bananas. I mean, it's like a movie. It's like Monty Python or something like that. But it really happened. Like serious people seriously discussed this, and Duff Green brought it to Abraham Lincoln and said, serious people are discussing this. This is all you got to do. What's the matter? What's the big deal? And Lincoln was willing to talk to this man. He'd known him for years. He didn't turn him away, but having talked with him, there ultimately was nothing to do. Duff Green said, please write me a letter saying you support this compromise. And Lincoln finally did, maybe to get him out of the office, I don't know, write him a letter saying, I don't support amending the Constitution, but if it happens, you know, what am I going to do about it? And then sends that letter in such a way that Duff Green would never receive it. So he doesn't, I mean, it's just kind of wild. I mean, we always have these kind of like you almost have an image of like someone playing billiards and you never hit it right in the pocket, right? You're like boing, 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 several bumpers on the way in. And so he wasn't willing to do that. And his party was not willing to do that because of that conviction that slavery was wrong. It was not something you could just like cut a deal and you're deciding how to divide $100 and finally you take 50 and I take 50. It wasn't that kind of thing. Lincoln believed that he was right on the issue. Lincoln also believed he had been elected president and he had the right and the responsibility, the duty to take charge of the whole country and not just part of it. He says, I believe to Thurlow Weed, a political boss, what a great name, Thurlow Weed.
A lot of great names in this book.
Thank you.
Incredible.
He says, my job is to run the machine as it is. And he went in with that attitude. So in presenting Lincoln as someone who could make deals and reach across the aisle and talk with other people, I want to avoid any mistake. He wasn't a guy who said, I want peace at any price. He was a war president. He wasn't a guy who said, I'm willing to give anything to have your approval, because he wasn't that kind of person either. He would go into a meeting and see if of the 10 important things, there was one thing he could work with the other person on. And if he could do that, that was enough. And he wasn't going to castigate the person for the other 9. He was going to work on the one. And even if they couldn't find the one, he would still take the meeting and see, what can I learn from this? What advantage can I gain from this? I think this is different than the way that a lot of us are told we should approach our interactions today, where we're told it stains us to talk with someone on the other side. It stains us to talk with someone who is disagreeable, or it's naive because they're never going to change their minds. I don't think that Lincoln often in these meetings was trying to like convert someone. He wasn't going to try to convert Duff Green, this conspiracy theorist. Can I just pause for a second? This is crazy. You've never heard such a thing before. Duff Green had this conspiracy theory that anti-slavery people, people on the other side, the woke left, was importing immigrants to the country to cast illegal votes in an election. I mean, can you believe that anybody in American politics would say anything so crazy? But that's what his thing was.
It's funny that the response then is the same now, which is like, we're not that coordinated. We can't barely get it together to go to the polls ourselves.
Exactly, exactly. How would you get people from?
Right.
Anyway, so the point is, I mean, he met this guy, and he might be condemned today. He would be asked by reporters as he went to Air Force One or U.S. Cavalry One or whatever it would be in 1861. He would be asked, like, did you really meet with Duff Green? Did you meet with that slave guy? What did you mean by meet? He met all kinds of people. And of course also met with abolitionists and people who very publicly criticized him for not going far enough on slavery.
I mean, that is a little bit what stuck with me about this book. I was reading it and thinking about our current political situation. No names, I won't mention any names. But when I saw the parts of him that seemed like Obama, I was also could note that like both the Lincoln presidency and the Obama presidency seemed to bring on some fracture that seem kind of at odds with who they are as people. I mean, you elect these people because you think that they can talk to anybody, and then the outcome is almost extremism, which is not their fault, but happens kind of under their watch.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot that's really interesting in that comparison. And again, we're not saying Obama is Lincoln or anything like that. But Obama himself drew the comparison. He launched his first presidential campaign at the old state capitol in Springfield, Illinois, which is where Lincoln had worked as a state legislator. They now have a door in the side of the building that they call the Obama door because he walked through it on his way to the stage or whatever.
Never named doors after me when I walk through them. I don't know.
Well, and now that you've done 3 bestsellers,
Yeah.
they definitely will.
The Josie Duffy doors right there.
That'd be awesome. Which door is it? It's this one back here. It's the stage door. It's stage left. It's stage left. Was I telling a story? Oh, yes, I was. I was talking about Barack Obama. Yeah, Obama's a fascinating figure because he did try to appeal to different kinds of people, and he did try to build coalitions. He had this image. I want to speak carefully about this because I'm not saying what everybody thought, but I think that a lot of people thought that Obama was like some kind of radical progressive, and what they meant was he was a person of color. His actual politics were fairly kind of mainstream Democrat, which means if you're a Republican, you thought he was way too left, but he wasn't as far left really as you could be. And he reached out to different kinds of people. Maybe as a guy from Indiana, I was particularly sensitive to this. I mean, as a black man who also had a family immigrant background, he appealed to large numbers of people of color in American cities and wherever, and on the coasts and wherever you would find diverse communities in America. But he was from Chicago. And I think he spoke Midwestern in a sense. and he could appeal to people in middle America, whether they were white, black, or anything else. I have a memory after the 2008 election of going to see my brother in Indiana, who is basically a Republican, and he was in the basement, we're watching football or whatever, with his friend, his neighbor, and he said, I voted for Obama. Then he said, don't tell my wife. And then his friend said, same in my house. And he won Indiana, which no Democrat had done for decades, and by the way, no Democrat has done since or is anywhere close to doing. He was able to appeal to different kinds of people. He was able to build a coalition. He was able to be so strong in the Midwest, interestingly enough, that Democrats believed that they had totally won states like Michigan and Wisconsin and didn't even have to campaign there in order to win. And of course, they lost them and lost the election in 2016 when there was a different candidate who had very similar politics, actually, but was less successful, perhaps, in reaching out to different kinds of people. Obama even worked certain issues in ways that people close to him saw as paralleling Lincoln's approach on slavery. Lincoln did not issue the Emancipation Proclamation on day one. I love it when presidential candidates say, on day one, I'm going to do blah.
Right.
He didn't even do it on day 100. It was like a year and a half into his presidency, a year and a half into the war, until he felt it was the right time and that he had the authority, the necessity, the constitutional necessity to do it. Obama was against gay marriage for almost 4 years of his presidency, and then one day was for it, and talked in public about how he had thought this through and come to a certain evolution. And I don't want to doubt his personal moral journey, but what was also happening at the same time was a political shift that made it possible for someone to support gay marriage and not lose re-election. And there is something in that. I mean, we would like our leaders to be moral leaders, but they have to mesh that morality with the practical necessity to win elections, or it doesn't mean much of anything to anybody. They have to think about their interests and the interests of their parties. And Lincoln thought about interest a lot. In fact, he thought a lot about the self-interest of voters that he wanted to appeal to. He recognized that he needed to appeal to their self-interest and hopefully mesh it with a higher moral cause. And so he would give white voters, for example, reasons that slavery was bad for them, why it harmed the reputation of America, why it damaged free labor as well. And just he was thinking all the time in practical terms. Again, I'm not saying that they were equally successful, but I think there was something of Obama that explicitly as well as implicitly tried that kind of approach. Oh, can I say one more thing? I mean, I think the reason that they both provoked a reaction was not just because they reached out to the other side, but because each was a kind of herald of change. Obama was a physical representation of an America that was becoming more and more diverse. And the anxiety over that diversity is not the only thing that has happened in America the last 15 years, but it's one of the underlying things that has caused a lot of tension and confusion about what exactly it means for everybody and how we're supposed to deal with it. And by the way, in the spirit of Lincoln, if there's somebody here who's uncomfortable about that now, it's fine that you're here and talking with us. I'm glad that you're with us rather than
Douglas and the Lincoln Douglas.
Yeah,
debate.
exactly. And Lincoln was a herald of change because no one had ever been elected president before who just said slavery was wrong, who didn't kind of obfuscate on the issue or wasn't literally a slave owner as a number of presidents had been.
One thing about Lincoln, I think, are we coming up on time? Okay, we're good. Okay. One thing about Lincoln that you guys may know, he was assassinated. Sorry to break that news to anybody who wasn't aware. Spoiler alert. And it does shape his legacy in a lot of ways, right? Like I was listening to an interview where you were talking about how it feels similar to Martin Luther King. He dies at a point where he doesn't write like you said, he doesn't write a memoir.
Yeah.
You don't have as much as his own words recounting his experiences, and you kind of have the words of other people, often by the lens of he's dead,
Yeah.
which,
Yeah.
changes how people recount things. How do you think that it impacted his legacy? And I guess also, what do you think he would have thought about what came after? What do you think he would have thought about Reconstruction? What do you think he would have thought about the years following the Civil War?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say exactly how he would have managed Reconstruction, but surely differently than Andrew Johnson, his successor, did. Johnson decided, or was persuaded, that what was necessary was a South that was as close as possible to what it had been before without official slavery. And so he battled with radical Republicans in Congress who wanted a lot more equality. Many Southerners, white Southerners, viewed that effort at equality basically as an effort to get revenge on them or punish them. But I think that a lot of radical Republicans actually thought that equality would be good and necessary, and that it also matched their political interests, since black people voting would probably change the political equation, but there was a moral element to it. I think that Lincoln, as he was throughout his presidency, would not have done everything at once, but he would have continually been pushing and nudging Southern states as they came back into the Union to allow for as much equality as they possibly could endure. And that's what he was talking about, in fact, in the last speech of his life. And one of the last meetings in the book is a meeting that he has with a guy who'd been a Supreme Court justice, quit to become a Confederate official, and then tried to negotiate an end to the war with Lincoln. Lincoln talked with this guy about restoring the government of Virginia that had been there before, but ultimately wasn't really willing to do that in any meaningful sense. He wanted to build new structures that would be more equal structures than what had come before. You mentioned another thing, which if we got the signal before the hook comes out, maybe this is one more point to make, because you mentioned Jonathan Eig's book about Martin Luther King. Are people familiar with this book? Yeah, it's great. If you need a doorstop, it's like, but it's so good. It is so good. And one of the points that he makes is that Martin Luther King has been polished or sanitized. People kind of hold him up piously, but don't talk about what he stood for really.
Let's just all be friends.
Yeah, let's all be friends. Yeah. And they'll talk about the content of their character lines from the I Have a Dream speech, but maybe not his more radical critique of American society and what was wrong and what he felt needed to be done. He becomes, in Eig's telling, this very meaningful figure that we make almost meaningless, because you can hold him up for anything. I mean, you can put him in a Nike commercial. You can use him, as people literally have, to argue against teaching about race in schools. You can do lots of different things with Martin Luther King. And Ige argued that he, in fact, was a specific person with a specific faith, with a specific background, with specific beliefs about America and its place in the world, some of which would make us, even today in our supposedly more advanced time, rather uncomfortable. Lincoln also became, after his assassination, this kind of saint or martyr to the nation, martyr to national unity. He was held up and admired by people for every cause. The former Confederates, by the way, adopted Lincoln and said if only he had lived, he would have been a lot nicer than these radical Republicans are. He would have kept Congress in line. I don't see how he could possibly have been any more sympathetic to the Confederate cause than Andrew Johnson turned out to be, so they're probably wrong there. But and he's on the money. He sells insurance. He's got all these things that he does. But in reality, he was a specific American in a specific context who wrestled with a terrible moral problem, and had his flaws. I mean, it's hard to even say exactly what's in his soul, because he was a politician and he spoke so carefully. But he made a difference. And he made a difference for the country and helped to leave us the inheritance that we hopefully will not waste today. Thank you.
I'm going to go to audience questions, or else I will talk till midnight. And so if anybody in the audience has questions, we have Claire here who will hand you the mic, and we'd love to hear what you have to ask.
In answer to the first question, it is number 11 on the New York Times bestseller list. This week.
After tonight,
Let's hope
One.
so.
Thank you. One.
Let's hope so.
What was the most dramatic of the meetings, in your opinion?
Sure. Let me talk. I could talk about some. I'm kind of obsessed with these meetings, but let's talk about the one with Frederick Douglass, because we haven't yet. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and Frederick Douglass was kind of relieved because he'd been publicly advocating for such a thing for a year and a half and publicly castigating Lincoln for failing to do so. After the proclamation was announced, Frederick Douglass, having escaped from slavery, having become a great orator, and I feel the need to stop and say, different than Stephen Douglas in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, different guy. Frederick Douglass became a military recruiter. The Emancipation Proclamation was designed not only to free black laborers, but to allow them to be free to enlist in the Union Army and add to the Union manpower advantage. And Douglass had advocated that too for a couple of years, and he became a recruiter. His own sons enlisted, and he encouraged other black men to enlist and said, you will receive equal pay, you'll receive equal treatment to white men, and your service, in addition to being for your country and for the freedom of those still enslaved, will be a blow for equality for black men in this country. And then he felt that Lincoln's administration made a liar out of him because they didn't get equal pay and they didn't get equal promotion and they had other disadvantages as well. There were even some black soldiers that referred to the Lincoln despotism because they weren't being paid equally, which was an insult. And there were a lot of men who refused any pay, which was a hardship for their families because they said, we will not accept pay on unequal terms. Frederick Douglass finally had had enough of this and tried to quit as a recruiter. And his superiors said, go to Washington and complain to the president, because he didn't want to lose this prize recruiter. And Douglass went. And several things are remarkable about this meeting. One of them is that Lincoln saw him at all because Douglass had so fiercely criticized him. Lincoln found out that he was in the outer office, a crowded anteroom full of white men, according to Douglass, and said, send him in. And within 2 minutes, Douglass was in the office. The next remarkable thing is that Lincoln admitted part of Douglass's criticism. Douglass said, you've been too slow and vacillating. And Lincoln said, well, I admit that I've been slow. There are political reasons for this. I'm dragging all these conservative people along, and there's only so much I can do at each step. There was a period, he even says, when some of the white men in government wanted to put black soldiers in different uniforms so there would not be any implied equality with white men. He got them into the same uniforms, and he said that was an accomplishment, but I'm still working on the equal pay and other things, and I admit that I've been slow. But then he said, I do not believe that I've been vacillating or that anyone can prove that I have. Once I take a position, I never retreat from it. And Douglass took that as a sign that he would never retreat from his commitment against slavery, which of course he didn't. And Douglass walked away from this meeting not entirely agreeing with Lincoln, but finding him to be, quote, reasonable. That's a word that he used in a letter that he wrote a short time afterward. Douglass himself, this is one of the things that makes the meeting so amazing. I mean, they're both like pragmatic guys. Douglass obviously knew the outrage of slavery and was a very strong abolitionist, but he was also a pragmatist who supported Lincoln's Republican Party even though he didn't think they were radical enough. He thought they could strike a blow against slavery, that they had the best chance to do it. That's a political lesson in and of itself. He was pragmatic enough to deal with Lincoln, even though he also publicly criticized Lincoln. Like a lot of activists, he had an outside game and an inside game. The outside game was throwing punches. The inside game was working with people he could work with. Lincoln was also doing an outside game and an inside game. And the inside game was saying, listen, Mr. Douglass, here are my political realities. But the outside game, and I think this is morally important, having said to Douglas, I have to do things that are a little wrong and not equal because of political reality, he went out and tried to change the political reality. Within a few weeks afterward, he was asked to address a mass rally in his home state of Illinois where many white men were angry about the Emancipation Proclamation. He couldn't go to the rally, but he sent a letter, a kind of speech to be read aloud to the rally. And he's very, very frank with these white voters. And he says, and I'll use the language of the time, to be frank, you disagree with me about the Negro. You don't seem to think that black people should be free, and I do. He didn't try to persuade them to have a different opinion. He tried to persuade them that free people were in their interests because they were fighting in the army, and they had by then helped to win significant victories and open the Mississippi River. And so he was telling these people, have whatever beliefs you want. It is in your interest to support equality. So he's continuing to make the argument in favor of a more perfect version of equality than the United States had achieved up to that time. And he's working to gain the support of people who, in principle, would not agree with that at all. And that last part, I think, is powerfully important. If you're going to say, I'm being unfair to you for political reasons, I think you also need to say, and I'm working on it.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an impossible question,
I love those kind.
but I'm just curious about what you think, because you know so much about Lincoln. What would you guess would be his sort of opinion or feeling about where we are today? Do you think he would be satisfied? Do you think he would be focused on process and communication and the practical side of what you've described about his character? Or do you think he would have substantive differences?
He'd be on Twitter.
He
That's
would,
what I want to know.
he would, no, he'd be on Threads. Instagram, actually, with the beard. I mean, it's good
Great.
with political symbolism.
Great
He'd be on Instagram.
Instagram content.
Exactly. Can you just imagine, like, him with a selfie with that beard? Like, look at my new beard. Look at it from this angle. It'd be great. It'd be great. I mean, it's hard to say in any particular detail what he would think about, Kevin McCarthy or, abortion rights or any number of things. I mean, there were the state of race. Well, let's. I want to use a quote that he used in the Lincoln-Douglas debates that feels to me to be a key to his political philosophy, and it relates to the meeting that we just described with Frederick Douglass. He, of course, picked up from abolitionists the idea of quoting the Declaration of Independence about all men are created equal. And that's a thing that not quite all of us apparently, but most of us believe. But then what do we mean when we say it? And how do we achieve it? And what does it even mean to achieve it? Lincoln himself, in this debate in 1858, said effectively, I paraphrase very loosely here, but he said the founding fathers, of course, did not achieve perfect equality, but they laid the promise on the table. And then he went on to say, and this is pretty close to his words, he said this state of perfect equality, this state of equality is never perfectly attained, but can be constantly approximated in ways that adds to the happiness and well-being of all people, of all colors, everywhere. And in a way that is a modest goal compared to everyone lives in peace and happiness and perfect equality. It's an acknowledgement of our imperfections. It's an acknowledgement that we live in a democracy with many different backgrounds and points of view where we may not even agree on what equality is or what is important or what is not. It's an acknowledgement of human failings, and it's a commitment continuously to work on it. I think if he was around today and if he was in politics, he'd need a new wardrobe, and I don't know what his positions would be exactly on race or anything else, but I think he'd be working on it. And he'd be thinking in terms not just of striking the right pose, but of attacking systems that hold people down.
Other questions? I know, okay, perfect.
I really appreciated your what you said about how you're like I'm really writing about the past. I'm not talking about the present while pretending to talk about the past. That being said, you know, reading your book, I couldn't get the image out of my mind of the fact that the Confederate flag never made it into the U.S. Capitol during the Civil War. It took January 6th to do that.
That's true.
So, and like, I hesitate to say, are we on the cusp of a second Civil War? Because that seems too simple, but for lack of a more nuanced way to ask it, I mean, how much trouble are we in? I'm not naive enough to think that there was ever some time where everybody magically got along.
Yeah.
But you, as a student of history, you do have to go back to the days leading up to the Civil War to find anything even remotely close to the hatred and dysfunction we've got right now. So is history about to repeat itself, or at least as Mark Twain supposedly said, is it going to rhyme? Is it going to rhyme a lot?
I don't, at this time, I mean, I'm terrible at forecasting. I don't believe in forecasting, really, because I believe in reporting with reliable sources, and I have none in the future. With that said, I don't, at this time, in the near term, expect a civil war, because I really don't understand what it would truly, truly be about. We have these profound divisions in society, not just race, but, I mean, we could talk about abortion, we could talk about gender, we could talk voting, we could talk about the economy, we could talk about a lot of different things. But we also have a lot of disagreements that are about cultural differences and memes and attitudes and expressions. I mean, a lot of populism is just about the way you say things or being mean, which is a theme that sounds like you're writing about. And it's hard to see how you would like divide up the country with armies to have a war over memes. I do think it's possible that we have political violence in the near term. And the reason I say that is because of my understanding of history. I mean, political violence has been a large part of America a lot of the time, and especially in times of disturbance. That doesn't mean the Civil War. But think about Reconstruction, where there was a lot of what I think we would call terrorism today. And there were elections that were in certain states that were decided by battles as much as bullets. And we could go to other periods, a lot of them having to do with race, but not all, like having to do with labor disputes and other things, where there's been just a lot of political violence in this country. And so we should be mentally prepared for that just because there has been. But in addition to not seeing a cause, an underlying reason really for a civil war, I have some confidence, in spite of our collective effort to blow our confidence, in the people of this country and of the institutions of this country that have taken us this far and maybe can take us a little bit farther.
So excuse me, we have a couple people want to ask questions, but we're getting short on time. So are y'all up
Lightning
for like
round.
a rapid
We'll
fire?
do short
Okay.
answers. I should have done shorter answers to now. Have I been going too long?
Great.
Okay, thanks.
A couple times that Lincoln revered the Constitution and he felt constrained by what the law and what the Constitution limited. And some politicians on both sides today seem to be quicker to want to end run the provision of the law they don't like or something in the Constitution. Speak to his reverence for that and what lessons we might take from that, and how to change the law as opposed to, skirt it or end run it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I should acknowledge, and somebody in this room maybe knows, as president, there was an occasion where he kind of ran roughshod over someone's interpretation of the Constitution. He was told that he couldn't arrest people without, suspected rebels, without bringing them before a judge, and he refused to obey that order from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and decided he would interpret the Constitution for himself, that he didn't have to do that, which is a little awkward. But by and large, yeah, he believed that the rule of law was what kept us from tearing each other apart. And he found that painful in many cases because some of the laws were morally wrong. But he believed in the Constitution. He believed in the Republican system, and I don't mean Republican Party, but small r Republican. he believed in upholding these institutions, and that came, I think, a little bit from his view of human nature. Essentially, that we needed laws because that was the agreed upon, those were the agreed upon rules for society. And if we didn't have that, he said in a speech in 1838, we might have some wild populist would-be dictator who tried to take over the country, some guy with big hair. That last part he didn't say, but the other parts he actually did. He believed in the rule of law, and that was another motivation for fighting the Civil War. As I said, run the machine as it is, which I think he saw as his first duty and our first duty as citizens. We've inherited this machine. The first thing to do is run it as it is. Maybe the next thing is to help it to run a little better.
Please join me in
Thank
thanking
you.
Steve Inskeep and Josie Duffy Rice.
Thank you. Wow. Great.
Thank you all so much. We will meet you out in the lobby in the
Thank you,
Draper
Steve.
room for signing. Please get your copy of the book. It goes towards next week's New York Times bestseller list. It's up to y'all. Thank
Yay.
you.
Well, I don't know. We'll see.